la la. Hi friends! Today we are going to be going over how to write speeches. This, again, basics. We're only going to be looking at constructives, refutations, and crystals. There are a bunch of other types of speeches. So if you are a presiding officer, you have a housekeeping and a nomination speech. If you are doing national circuit, there's a morning hour speech. If you are doing an amendment, there's an amendment speech. And a bunch of other things that are outside of what someone who is very, very new to Congress would need to know. These are the basics. These are speeches that you're going to see in every single chamber, hopefully, if they're done right. And so we're going to talk through them. We're going to go over how to write them, the different types, and stuff that you need to know in order to write a strong speech. Very informal. This is going to be a lot less structured, which I know, surprising, didn't think it could get less structured, but regardless, I'll talk you through it as we go, and hopefully you're able to get something useful out of it in order to benefit you and your Congress kiddos, captains, coaches, whatever the heck that you are here watching on behalf of. First thing first, within every speech, there are different elements with different functions or purposes. So generally, you're going to have an introduction, and then you're going to have a body, and then you're going to have a conclusion. That's the general format. In that introduction, you should have an attention-getting device, background, any information that is necessary to know about the legislation. So like not background, but lines within the legislation that are going to be essential to the contentions that you are building, and then a thesis. That thesis needs to declare which side of the debate you are on, and then go over the signposting or body structure of the speech that you will be presenting. So say, for example, you're going to be doing a 3-point speech. Then you have an introduction. Your thesis will say first, economy, second, environment, third, world peace. And then when you're going through the body, first is going to be, should I say environment or economy? Whichever one is first, you need to keep it in the same order as your thesis and go through the body paragraphs until you get to that conclusion. Your conclusion is super, super quick. It's going to sum up all of the tags again, and you might touch on the impacts if time permits. But remember that for a congressional debate speech, you have 3 minutes. So in an ideal round of Congress, as the cycles elapse, you are going to start with constructive, build in more refutation, less constructive, then even less constructive, more refutation, some weighing, mostly refutation, weighing, and then get into weighing crystallizations. That's for like a 4 or 5 cycle speech chamber. Generally, debate's dead after the 5th or 6th cycle. Sometimes people like to beat that dead horse, and by that I mean they will continue to give speeches that are repetitive, not bringing in any new information, giving the same contentions over and over and over and over. I always recommend that after debate has gone stale, you move on to the next item. If there aren't enough items, that really is the tournament's fault. But it's better to give a strong speech, one strong speech, than 2 crappy ones. Constructive speeches have constructive contentions. Contentions are arguments. Constructive contentions are arguments that are trying to establish something, not respond to someone. Those are refutation contentions. A constructive contention has generally claim, warrant, data, impact. Your claim is your position or your argument. Your warrant is the reasoning that the claim is true in relation to the legislation and the way that the world is. The data is the evidence to support the claim, and the impact is the truth of why the claim matters. So, for example, let's talk about wild lawns. If you were to have a piece of legislation that's trying to introduce pollinator lawns, so those lawns that have wildflowers, weeds, clover, whatever that may be, then your claim could be wild lawns require less water than grass lawns. That's what you're going to be arguing. That's what your contention is going to be aiming to establish or assert. Your warrant is plant biodiversity, a variety of root lengths, plant types, and water retention causes native plants to retain water more effectively than grass. That's an elaboration from the wild lawns require less water. It's explaining the how. How is this possible? The data is the evidence to support your claim. So a 10-year study conducted by Columbia University, published in 2018, found that the average American household uses 30% of their water for gardening and landscaping, totaling nearly 9 billion gallons of water a day. Native pollinator lawns, on the other hand, require a fraction of the same water use as other plants and are naturally adapted to their environment and able to retain more water than traditional grass lawns. Within that data, you had the source, Columbia University. You had the period length of the study, 10 years. You had the publication date. As just a point, this was made up. So if you go to look for the study, you might not be able to find it. And then that's explaining and quantifying the warrant that has been established. So remember, that claim was that they use less water. The warrant is explaining biodiversity. And the data now is explaining, like, okay, traditional grass lawns use this much, biodiverse lawns use that much. Those are claim, warrant, data. Now your impact is why the truth of the claim matters. And that's kind of, I always explain it as why I should care. Or your audience, why your audience should care. The impact within this contention is by passing a bill to encourage native pollinator lawns, the US will waste less water on aesthetic irrigation purposes. So put all together, your claim, warrant, data, impact, make an assertion, expand on that, quantify it, and explain why the audience should care. And that's what each contention within your speech should do, each constructive contention. The basic structure of a refutation contention is introducing whatever contention that was constructed you're going to be responding to, and explaining why it is incorrect, irrelevant, foundationally untrue, outside the scope of the debate, whatever it is. So the way that you would do that is by saying, Representative Smith on the affirmation made the assertion that wild lawns require less water than grass lawns because of biodiversity of native plant species. Understand that this blah, 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 getting into why it's not true or not relevant or whatever. So introduce, cite whoever introduced it, reference the representative or senator, and then explain why they're incorrect. So let's say synthetic versus organic fertilizers is the piece of legislation. It's some sort of something transitioning the US from synthetic to organic. If I'm on the affirmation and I just built a constructive contention saying, yes, we should pass this legislation because synthetic fertilizers have nitrogen and phosphorus, both of which cause algal blooms and are contributing to the dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico. The negation, in response to my argument, would be able to come up and say something along the lines of, Representative Smith on the affirmation brought up the point of algal blooms in relation to synthetic fertilizers. However, it's important to understand that there's no higher proportion of algal bloom if it's synthetic versus organic fertilizer, blah, 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 blah. Here's my evidence, blank. So what they have done is they have acknowledged my contention, the constructive contention that I gave. They're saying, okay, this is what she's saying, this is why she's wrong. And that's what refutation is. It's explaining someone's argument fairly and then responding to it in a way that is either minimizing the scope, magnitude, impact, timeframe, or just saying it's wrong. Like it's not correct, it's not relevant, it doesn't need to be considered because of blank. And then you explain why. So that's refutation. The next thing that you're getting into is weighing. So weighing is a little different from refutation in the sense that refutation is responding to the argument. Weighing is saying, like, okay, that argument's valid. Yes, there is truth, there is merit to the idea that synthetic fertilizers create more algal blooms and dead zones than organic. But, and this is the but that gets into weighing, that is less important than this issue that I've presented on the negation. So maybe the negation is saying that in order for organic fertilizers to be produced, unicorns are chopped up into tiny little bits and sprinkled all over the ground, and that's organic fertilizer. That's the only organic fertilizer that exists. Then they could make the argument that we need to save the unicorns on the negation because that's more important than saving fish that are in the dead zones. Obviously, fictional argument, but that's the idea. It's not you are wrong in your assertion. It's your assertion is correct, but it's not as important as, and then you create a constructive argument in response or weigh it against one that has already been constructed on your side that you are extending to that level of flow on the debate. Crystallization, again, a bit different. It's similar to weighing in the sense that it's acknowledging the validity on both sides. So affirmation and negation both have valid claims, but this is why we're going to sway this round of debate to the affirmative. When you're doing a crystallization, the main idea is you want to look at the themes that have popped up between different speakers' contentions and said, like, okay, all of these are on economy, all of those are on environment, all of those are on natural disasters. So in that crystallization speech, you're going to be going through and saying the points brought up by the affirmation concerning the economy spearheaded by Representative Smith, Representative McIntyre, Representative Mongolic can all be reduced to blah, 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 make a claim. And then the crystallization is either going to refute that or weigh it against something that has been asserted by the opposite side. So again, it's playing with refutation and weighing, but it's crystallizing and condensing the arguments on one side and pairing them for response to the other. You can do that in refutation if there are two arguments that are super similar, but remember that those arguments need to be so similar that they're almost indistinguishable. That's possible to do, and it happens a lot when people do extensions off of an argument already built on their side, but it's different from crystallization in the sense that crystallization really is like clumping like themes. So all of this is to say that in a successful round of Congress, there's a lot going on further than just a 3-point speech that you're going up and saying, this is my point, this is why we pass, thank you. You're also interacting with other people's arguments. You're refuting them, you're weighing them, you are crystallizing them at the end of the debate. And with those different functions and different purposes, as the round of Congress evolves, so too comes different types of speeches. The first type of speech that we're going to talk about, constructives. Constructives can be deceiving in the sense that people think that they're easy. And you know what? They are the easiest type of speech to do. But there's little differences within types of constructive speeches and their functions that you need to pay attention to. The first speech on any piece of legislation, when the presiding officer is calling to the floor, the first speaker, they're going to call first for an authorship. Remember, you can only give the authorship speech if you are the author of the legislation or if your tournament permits you to be going to the same school as the author of the legislation. Sometimes they'll also do like congressional districts, but if it's not your name on the bottom of the legislative item, do not raise your placard to give a speech as the author. Wait for the sponsorship, the second speech that's called. So after the presiding officer has called for the authorships, no author is standing, then they're going to call for a sponsor. That sponsorship speech is functionally doing the same thing as the author, both of which are introducing the legislation, introducing how it is solving an issue with the status quo, how the world currently is, and explaining this is why the legislation was created and how it is specifically addressing the issue that you've laid out. For example, say that there's a lot of agricultural runoff causing dead zones. The author of the legislation or the sponsor of the legislation has the burden of quantifying the degree to which this is an issue, explaining how it is affecting people within the US or economy or environment or whatever the ramifications of the issue may be, and then explaining, so this is what the legislation is, this is why it's proposed, this is how it solves the issue, vote in the affirmation. And that's their goal. Constructives, the first constructive, especially that first affirmative speech, authorship or sponsorship, is really important to have a full idea of the background and the issue and how the legislation solves it. The first negative speech, so your N1, is going to either explain the status quo in a different way to show how this isn't really an issue and we don't need to pass the legislation, or explain how it is an issue and it deserves recognition, but that this legislation isn't solving it. That first cycle of debate is super important because it's giving you the framing for the round. So you know how like in PF and LD you have values and criterions and different definitions. This first cycle, the A1, N1 speeches of Congress, is where that all comes out. So that first affirmative speech explains the world as it is. First negative speech explains the world as it is, and either says, yes, this is an issue, but this isn't the legislation to solve it, or no, this isn't an issue, and here is why. So that's your first cycle. Both of those speeches should be constructive, so they are building contention. If there are any definitions that need to be clarified, questioners can ask them at that point during the questioning blocks. Very valid. If the author or sponsor or the first negative don't go into, don't elaborate onto what those definitions are, or there's some ambiguities within the legislation, you get to play with those as a speaker. You, further than the first cycle, can say, well, since the author didn't define this term, we can assume it to mean this. And sometimes people will use slightly abusive definitions. You get away with that a lot in Congress because there are 12 different people in a chamber, and if you can use a definition that's going to work to your advantage rather than one that the author forgot to lay out, it's helpful to be able to do that. That first negative isn't too different from the rest of the negatives. It generally has more of a constructive element to it rather than refuting anything that's been built. You can have refutation in the first neg. That's completely valid. But if you are planning to speak on the first cycle and have a negative speech, it's a very valid option for you to write out everything in the way that you would an author. Just be prepared that you don't have preference to give a first neg. So if someone with higher precedence or recency wants to give that speech, it's theirs. Moving on, past that first cycle, and really past that first affirmative speech, every single speech thereafter should have some type of reference to a contention or a speaker or an argument or a questioning block that had happened earlier on the flow of debate. For those of you who don't know, when I'm talking about the flow of debate, I'm talking about the way that arguments are interacting with one another as the debate is progressing. So that first affirmative is really giving your framing, first negative is adjusting that framing, and then continuing just with the claims, contentions, data, the names of whoever is making those points in order to give them credit when you are responding to them in refutation or crystallization or weighing. But that flow is just like the notes that you are taking. So everything past the first cycle on the flow should have refutation built into it. That refutation can be, I'm going to extend on a point brought up on my side, but explain how the impact can be altered in some way to affect a demographic that wasn't previously mentioned. It can be responding to an argument on the opposite side of the debate and explaining, we already talked about refutation, you're explaining why it doesn't matter, isn't relevant, or is untrue. Everything past the first cycle should have refutation in it. Constructive speeches, generally, you're going to have that introduction, body, 3 points is fairly typical, and then a conclusion. That refutation structure is going to be very, very different. So you could have a constructive contention within a refutation speech, but if you're going to have a constructive contention, don't let it be something that has already been mentioned. If someone has already brought up the point that, no, these are unicorns that we are spreading as organic fertilizer, don't go up and be like, wow, it's unicorns. No one has talked about this before. Because then the rest of the chamber is going to be like, were they listening earlier when we heard this contention already brought up? The judges are going to think that your speech is recycling other information. It doesn't seem like you're very engaged with the round. And that's just not a good position for you, you know? You want to seem like you put enough forethought into this debate that you're coming into it with unique ideas. That being said, when you're prepping research, you should probably have 5 points on one side of the debate or the other, just so that after that first cycle is given, you don't have all of your speeches and contentions, you don't have all of your contentions taken and your speech is able to adjust. So past that first cycle, if you're giving a refutation speech, you should have a point that no one has made yet. And I mean that as in it needs to be unique. If you don't have a unique point, have a unique impact. So someone else already introduced this idea. Let me expand on it and explain how the impact is affecting a different demographic than we previously mentioned. For your crystallization, you are not bringing in any new information. Remember, that's a different type of speech. That crystal is going to include weighing and refuting and synthesizing the information that's been brought up into like categories in order to respond to them and weigh and refute. But those crystallization speeches generally are not going to have the same structure as a constructive or refutation. Remember, constructive, intro, body, conclusion. Refutation, intro-ish, body is going to be a little bit more haphazard in the sense that you really are just responding to other contentions that have been built on the flow. And then your conclusion is going to be more or less just going back over the signposting that you could have forgotten to do. That crystallization is different. It's, all right, now that we've heard a full debate, we are going to walk back through the arguments and explain how this debate falls to the side of the affirmation. Stand with me, blah, 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 blah. There's really usually not a conclusion for crystals unless you are drawing back to your AGD in like a funny, cute way. And that's fine. Do that. But that's the gist of it. All right. We talked about constructive refutation weighing crystals. We talked about flows, cycles, speech timing. Speech timing is something that we should go over. So when you're timing a speech, especially for constructives, this is most true for constructives, you're going to have about a 30-second introduction, 40-second points, and a 20-second conclusion. That means that you have 3 points. You can sway from this. Of course you can. If you accidentally go over in one, you're going to have to go under in the other. But remember, it's to your benefit to have equal length of contentions. So if you have a contention that's a minute long, it would be better to give another one that's a minute long and super thorough and goes into details and maybe has like a sub point, instead of trying to squeeze 2 more in that are both 30 seconds. Because a minute 30, not as good as like 40 or 45, or even like 1 minute. Try to keep your contention length similar. That's less true for refutation. If someone has like a fully fleshed out point that's been getting a lot of callbacks throughout the flow, so a lot of people are referencing it, building off of it, extending from it, you might need to do a more thorough refutation on that contention than you would on, say, something that was mentioned once but is a flimsy argument. So it's not as important to have equally spaced or timed stuff, but you should. There are other types of speeches. There are final appeals, morning hour speeches, amendment speeches, emergency scenarios, round robins, amendments. There's questioning that we're going to go over into other stuff. But the main idea is that as you are going through a round of debate, you are going to see constructive, refutation, weighing, and crystal on the flow, kind of cascading as you go. Each cycle of debate is going to have less constructive, more refutation, weighing, crystal as you go down. That first cycle is going to have either an author or a sponsor and a first negation, and everything past that first cycle should have some type of refutation built into it. You can expand and extend points on your own side. If you do so, make sure there's a unique impact. Whatever you do, remember that you are debating the argument, you are debating the speech, you are not debating the person. Do not do ad hominem attacks. Do not stoop to that level. If you're using rhetoric, fine, just be nice with it. And yeah, I hope that that's helpful. Be sure to signpost as you're going through as well. We'll do some videos where I just sit down and write a speech with you so that you see, okay, this is how a speech is written. This is my research process. This is authorship versus a sponsorship versus a first negation versus a refutation versus a crystallization. And they're all different. So we're going to spend some time on those. It'll be a lot shorter, but that's the gist. Those are how speeches work with one another through a round of debate. I hope that that was helpful. I hope I didn't speak too quickly. I'm getting a lot more informal with these videos. I had 45 minutes to try and film something for you. Hopefully it is something you enjoy. Let me know what you need. Let me know what you want, and I'll try to make it happen. Until the next video, have a wonderful day. Thank you very much. Bye.